So today's topic, I called it just some difficult and controversial concepts of Lutheranism. So let's get started. And one of the things you probably will not hear me talking a lot about is Satan or the devil. It's in the Bible. Clearly, there is someone or something in the Bible that is identified. Jesus talks about the devil or Satan. But why don't we talk about this Satan and the devil? And does anyone feel like we don't get a lot of that, or you need more instruction on that, or how are you comfortable with this? Would you? Shut up, Rick.
No, about just like today, not.
Yeah. So let me start by saying I actually just was paying attention to our liturgy, and in the baptismal liturgy, there's a renunciation that was kind of added when we did the Cranberry book. And that renunciation is, do you renounce the forces of sin, evil, and the sin, Satan, and something like that. They changed the devil one to evil. And I'll tell you why. First of all, the notion of Satan in the Bible is all over the place. There is not a single understanding of who Satan or the devil is. In Job, actually, Satan is part of the Satan is part of the kind of the heavenly court. And he's he's the, have you ever heard of devil's advocate? He's the devil's advocate of the court. He's the one who says, so when God says, have you considered Job and how faithful he is? And what does Satan do? He says, well, of course he's faithful. You've been good to him, God. Just give him, put some roadblocks in his path, and he'll denounce you. He's just like all those other human beings. He's not so good. And he does that twice in that prologue of that conversation. But he's part of God's court. There is conversation. There is a place, and I think Ezekiel, where it does talk about a fallen angel that is oftentimes identified as this one. Jesus talks about, we just had the temptations of Jesus. And he says, get away from me, and you shall not tempt. And it's a conversation with another individual. Part of the reason we don't do this is that it creates some complications. And one is, by having Satan, it depicts an opposing force as powerful as God. Now, for a monotheistic belief, which we believe we are, the one God, there cannot be another God that's like equally as powerful. And so to do that and to say that, that there is, creates this problem. Even if we say that God has allowed Satan to kind of have a realm of the world, and as we heard in the temptations, Jesus was talking, and Satan offers all this to Jesus. It kind of suggests, all this has been given to me. Well, it suggests that God has kind of bestowed God with this. It becomes really difficult. There's what's the word I'm looking for? There's a logical, I'll remember it, but it's the kind of notion that, again, remember paradox and the central role that plays. That if God is good and if God is all powerful, then bad things shouldn't happen to people. And how do you explain that? Okay. And so what what it does is that it does this. And by having sometimes it's indicated by having an alternate or a power opposed to God. I just not sure that works. It also changes the whole thing about God's sovereignty. It makes this whole thing look like God really isn't in charge of all of this. And lastly, it avoids our human responsibility. Let me go back to saying, what I think it does is it kind of creates this kind of judgment place in the world. And I'm going to talk about judgment in just a minute. But this place where somehow our laws of like, if you do this, there's a punishment. And, and the kind of the cause effect thing that I was kind of talking about, that Jesus was kind of talking about today, doesn't kind of fit. And we forced God into this thing so that Jesus had to die for our sins. If you think about that, that's really ridiculous. At 8 years old, I forget how old I was, probably a little bit older. We had this Lenten thing, kind of like your little box, Joan, where at Lent, we could ask the pastor questions. And I said, well, if God can do anything, if God can forgive our sins, why did he have to die on the cross to do it? Why was there, it was like there was this magical, mystical law in place. And if you read Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it is these laws that were set in place. Well, that makes the law even more powerful than God. What the lion does is finds the loophole, right? And that the witch doesn't know about, and so then the lion is sacrificed, and it says, if you sacrifice, well, that puts that's this whole thing into some kind of mystical thing. What I think it also does is it avoids our human responsibility. How many of you have heard the devil made me do it?
Yeah.
Right? We're not ultimately responsible for that. So it takes Eve in the garden and Adam in the garden and says, the devil made me do it. Now, I would say that we are set up, but that's part of what I think it means to be free. I think that's what we call sin and human responsibility. Human responsibility is the sense that we choose God, but we can also choose not God. And so for a Lutheran, the reason we don't talk about evil or Satan, we talk about evil, I think, but we don't talk about Satan or the devil so much as we don't try to mystify a reason. It's nice. It creates some language. It's not a bad thing. It's not, we can understand that there is this force that kind of draws us away from God, right? There's this force that makes me want to, even when I think it's Romans 5, talks about Paul going, even when I want to do good, I do the wrong thing. How many people have done that? I know that, I'm on a diet. I know I shouldn't have that chocolate, but it's staring me in the face. Oh, and I justify it and I provide it, why do we do that? The devil didn't make me do it. I lost my willpower, but somehow the promise wasn't weighing in heavily enough, or the goal of what that was. So I think that's why you don't hear about the devil or Satan in our conversation, because it seems to make it out, and it seems to place God in a much less powerful mode than that. Does that make some sense to you? So when I don't preach about the devil, but you can call me on it, okay? That's part of one of the things I always hated about preaching is it was such a monologue. And I've always done better. One of the reasons I like being a chaplain is I like talking to people. I like talking with people. I like to hear their ideas. So this brings me to this whole thing of judgment. And again, when we make the law more powerful than God, we've done, it's like making the Bible more powerful than God. I believe in the Bible. Don't believe in the Bible. Believe in Jesus. The Bible's to point you to Jesus, but it's not to believe in the Bible. The Bible doesn't bring you salvation. The word in the Bible, the word that is presented through the Bible, brings you salvation. So again, one of the reasons for judgment is, sin is a human responsibility. And we can own that. And we understand law and gospel. We understand that God has some expectations, and there are consequences, but are they meant to, how is that judgment meant to be? What judgment does is it understands life in a duality, in kind of there's the good and the evil. And so when, at the end of the Apostles' Creed, and God created, and God will come to judge the living and the dead. The quick and the dead is the way I learned it. But what we kind of were taught during that time, probably more from the media, is that judgment was that God was either going to throw you into heaven or into hell. He basically had this judgment into two camps. And it was this black and white kind of thing. Well, think about our own judgment system. It doesn't judge people in its best. It doesn't judge people in that kind of way. It may, sentence someone to time and incarceration and stuff like that, but of its ideal, it's for several purposes. It's to, remove them from society. It is to provide some kind of consequence to their actions. It is to maybe provide restoration, right? To rehabilitate, or whatever we want to call it. It's not that black and white. I told you about my favorite book, The Great Divorce. If you've read that, it's kind of like God keeps giving people that opportunity, and it's their choice completely. It's not God's choice. So a lot of times when we think of judgment, we think about God as being this great judge about, our actions in our lives. Well, what we understand is that God's already judged us. God's already forgiven us. Forgiveness. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't hold us accountable, but it does mean that, it doesn't, expel us. And judgment is really a human concept. It's partly because we use judgment because I don't think we can kind of fully comprehend the power of grace, the power of mercy. We get it, little bits of it, but again, this is something that's divine. And for our little human brains and our human understandings, we don't quite get it. So we do understand that there is judgment that's used, but we don't talk a lot about that, especially not in terms of a heavenly judgment, that there are some who are damned and some who are saved. As I said last week, I think we believe in Lutheran, one of the Lutheran concepts is single predestination. It means that God has predestined all of us to be saved. That's the conditional kind of comment that God has put on us. If we choose to leave, it's not by our own choice. God's not going to lock the door and lock you in. But that's what that is. Any comments about judgment?
On this word judgment, you keep on using it. You don't give it a time frame per se. Maybe there isn't one. But are you talking about a judgment relative to this act, that act, this act, the totality of the acts while we are here? When you die, my understanding that the body is separated from the soul. Where does the body go? Where does the soul go? My understanding, the body deteriorates and leaves, and the soul goes. When does the judgment take place? At that time or at a future time when the Lord comes back? What about the book of life? How do all these things?
I think, and as I'm going to talk about afterlife, and that kind of thing, we're going to talk about that and why we don't do that, because
I'll come back next time.
no, I'm doing that in just a next slide or two. But what I'm really saying is I don't believe that that judgment, that notion of a final judgment is.
See, now you use the word final judgment. So are you saying there's a series of judgments? Then it's in some code.
That kind of-
5 he passed, 6 he didn't, so he's got to follow.
I think there's judgment all along. I think there's judgment along every day. We should judge ourselves. Does God judge us? God weeps for our moments of faithlessness, and God rejoices in our moments. So is God judging us? I don't know. But in terms of a final judgment, I think you won't hear Lutherans talk about that much. Because we don't, huh?
You will not hear
Lutherans talk about that much, because there is not an understanding that concept of some kind of ultimate time when God makes this judgment doesn't fit within this kind of understanding. It again divides the world into a duality. And again, one of the things we forget is that dualism, this or that, the kind of even what's the kind of logic that, if this and that, then this can't be what's in. Yeah. If then, what's it called? Forms of logic. Anyhow, this is a Western concept. It's a way of thinking, and was really developed Greek, then Latin, then European, but it's not really a concept of the East. East doesn't have this duality. Actually, the best way to understand, Eastern kind of thinking is probably the yin and yang. That you need both, and they both play a part in this to make the whole, and you need kind of both to make it happen. And to remember that Jesus was more of an Eastern thinker than a Western thinker, at least culturally. I don't want to kind of label that Jesus didn't use this, but this notion of this duality of that when body and soul depart, that's a duality. That's part of, huh?
Is that at death?
At death, yeah. That's a duality that I don't think that we really kind of put a lot of stock in, especially anymore. Understanding it's part of the limitations of a Western way of thinking. Same with judgment. The either or suggests is part of that it's either this or that. But that paradox, remember that paradox way of thinking says just because it's this doesn't mean it can't be that. I can believe that Jesus is 100% human and Jesus is 100% God. And I don't have to make a choice that God is either one or the other, or the logic is flawed, the reasoning is flawed.
No, I like the concept of, the mystery and our inability to comprehend grace in its entirety. That resonates well with me. I'm struck by, I've always been struck by, I thought in the Bible there were multiple verses that talked about, how you be saved or how you might.
There are.
Right?
There are,
yes. To me, the most powerful one is the one with Christ on the cross with the 2 robbers.
Mm-hmm.
And my assumption is Christ didn't know these guys before they were all.
My assumption.
Right?
Unless they made fast friends and walking to their executions.
One, all he said was he essentially rebuked the other criminal. Support in Christ. And Christ says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise."
Right.
Which to me seems like that's the grace that might be this mystery. He's going to heaven, right?
Right.
And now I don't know that says the other guy was banished to hell. I don't know that, but that is the assumption I made, I guess.
Of course, because you and I think in a Western way.
Right.
And we, of course, think that, of course, there was the good shoulder and the bad shoulder, right? The good guy and the bad guy. And what I'm trying to say is, I think that's part of the limitations of judgment, is because we've been taught that. That's part of our culture. That's part of the way we learn, especially in the West. If we had our education in the Middle East, in Iran, in India, in China, in Japan, we'd probably be thinking very differently about some of these concepts, because that now remember, a lot of that's been westernized too. We brought in these concepts, but I think what I'm saying is judgment becomes too limiting for us, and so we don't speak about judgment because we don't believe. Just like Jesus could forgive him, what if he had already died? Would that forgiveness have taken place? When does forgiveness have to take place? Can God, so let me just kind of go back into, where we get our traditions from. A lot of our traditions come from the Catholic Church, right? Catholic Church. So it's kind of helpful to understand how they understand things, right? And as a chaplain, I call for the sacrament of the sick, the anointing, extreme unction now is what it used to be called, or last rites, right? And that was, and you have to remember this notion. Remember how I talked about baptism? They would do the exorcism and then dunk you in the water and baptize you as quick so that you couldn't get another breath in to breathe in the evil spirits. Okay? And then you come out and you be saved, right? You're saved. Part of the notion of the last rites and the extreme unction was to have this thing be done right at the moment of death, so that no more sin could eke in to our bodies. We could be forgiven at that last moment. Vatican II kind of dismissed that kind of understanding, but it's still part of the understanding we go with. Why? Because it has to be done in this life. Because after this life, when that separation occurs, when the body and the soul separate, well, who says God can't forgive? After that, who says that God has a limited time? Who says God, who put these, so what I'm saying is judgment is a term that we understand, and it helps us sometimes talk about it. In terms of the Bible saying this, yes, the Bible does certainly say things like this. Jesus said it in today's reading, and unless you repent, you're going to die that same way. Well, I'm guessing no Towers of Siloam crushed a bunch of people after that. I'm guessing that Pilate didn't slaughter everyone who didn't repent. I'm guessing that what the Bible says sometimes contradicts itself.
Well, because I was always struck with, sections of this earth that have no introduction to Christ or Christianity,
Right.
And the contrast of, them just being damned because they don't accept Jesus. It just doesn't fit with an all-loving God.
Right.
And so I always struggled with that. And to me, the lesson is forget about my judgment of others' judgment, right? And just make sure that I guard my own faith, and I guard, as best I can, that. And,
I have enough work to judge myself, right? Yeah. And I think, part of where we've come from is saying, when we have to jump through hoops to make something work, to explain why God would not save that person who never heard of Jesus in some foreign land or something like that. And we find ourselves jumping through hoops that God does this and this, and it's kind of like we're making this up as we go along, not so much God is. And I think what we're saying is we have a limited understanding. We have concepts that help us understand. I always tell people, especially when talking about children, I ask, so do you have a faith that you can talk about death to your children with? It's good to have some handles to be able to talk about it. What I always tell people about us doing confirmation at 7th and 8th grade is it's ridiculous. This is the exact wrong time to confirm somebody. Because they're moving from a time of concrete thinking to a time of abstract thinking. Before they really get into abstract thinking. When you think about God, when you think about grace, when you think about these things, these are really abstract concepts. These are concepts like infinity and like when you're learning calculus and that kind of stuff that are being taught but not mastered in high school, are being maybe mastered in college a little bit. That's when people are gaining that. And we're giving kids concrete answers because that's what they can handle at 7th and 8th grade, to answer these things that suddenly they're encountering with abstract questions. Like, well, if God only saves those who are believers, then what about the, it doesn't make any sense to them. So that's why I think, we do this completely wrong.
Judgment, though, during that period of time when the body and soul is together, that's the period of time that you're being judged on, as I understand it. When I took communion here under Pastor John, our small catechism, which was printed and bound and everything else, I brought it last week and bring it this week for some reason. And it says in there, you're going to be judged based upon when you were alive, right? And I'm thinking in terms of the thief on the cross. Today you will be with me. He
right.
says, the Lord says this to him.
Right.
Well, if it's during the time that I'm alive, then it's my understanding that many people pray for the dead. What's the point? It's in black print in the small catechism.
I think
the edition we got that said you do not pray for the dead because they've already had the judgment period of the period they're being judged.
Yeah.
The gate's no longer open for that.
I completely understand, and I kind of agree with you. What I think I'm saying though is, and that's.
Excuse me, you agree with me? I'm just quoting somebody. I did not say that I do or do not.
Well, I agree with what you brought out. That
Right.
Praying to the dead kind of doesn't. I mean, it's kind of out of our hands now, right? Which brings us to this kind of notion of afterlife and this whole notion. Go ahead.
Just to cloud the issue further.
Good.
I think the tradition at the time of Luther and the Catholic background that he came from as a priest in the Catholic Church and being a theologian was that there was purgatory. And that purgatory was a way stop between heaven and hell. And not only that, I think the grade schools of the Catholic Church, with the majority of the people who were attending it for hundreds of years, were inculcated with that. I know that I was. And that you did pray for the dead. It was very important that you pray for the dead,
Right.
because the vast majority of us, I mean, he didn't say the vast majority. I'm entering my own comment at that point. Up until that point, if everything I said is true, at this point, we're going to wind up in purgatory because we're not perfect people.
Right.
You didn't suffer greatly there, but you weren't fully ready for God because you had some transgressions. So I think that concept then integrated into pray for the dead, pray for your mother, pray for your father and all that, because they may be in purgatory and we want to get them in heaven as quickly as it can, where we will join them because we're going to be good people.
Purgatory was not a really good place, but it wasn't necessarily, it wasn't final judgment.
It was not.
But
it was an interim stopping point, but a lot of people wound up there and you wanted to pray for them.
pretty much everybody landed there. But, again, on that scale, the people who lived better lives didn't spend as much time there and didn't need, as much as a push to get over. There were others that needed heavy lifting to get across. Which brings me to Luther, because one of the problems was that the indulgences were then expanded to not only your own self, but you could then start buying indulgences because I want to save Rick's life because, So we're having a big indulgence sale today, and anyone who would like to help save Rick in purgatory, and became this fundraiser. And so Luther essentially got rid of the notion of purgatory, which is really kind of, if you look, I was noticing that another church said still, and he descended into hell. That was the LBW version. He descended into hell. The ELW, the New Cranberry book, it says it descended to the dead. Now, the dead is this place called Sheol in the Old Testament. Sheol was just kind of a place of the dead. It didn't have, it sometimes was associated with hell, but sometimes it was just this kind of like this purgatory. It was kind of just a realm, a land of, you might think about any zombie lovers out here, kind of this land of zombies, just kind of, without any kind of moral place, but they're just dead. There were places like this in Greek and Latin mythology as well. So, which brings us to the other problem with the afterlife, because there was, and Luther was fighting this, and it really kind of got rid of this whole notion of purgatory, because there was nothing more we could do. You couldn't pray, you couldn't buy their way out of heaven, you couldn't do good works on their behalf. Their time was their time. Okay, but that's because, again, why you won't hear me talking about judgment is because that's kind of suggesting that God has this terminal judgment, this ultimate judgment. I don't know what else to believe. I just believe that God is ultimately God's purpose is not to judge and divide. God's purpose is to unify and restore and recall. God was reconciling all things unto himself. So, when you look in the Bible, a lot of it depends on how you read the Bible. If you look, you can definitely find even Jesus saying there are some circumstances that cause, death or eternal death, and there are circumstances that cause life. There's that judgment. But there's other passages that are not nearly as clear that would suggest that. And so, again, it goes back into how Lutherans read the Bible. We read the Bible, we tend to read the Bible not to idolize the Bible, but to understand the Word, and the Word is Jesus, and Jesus embodies that Word. And then we try to ask who's Jesus, and he's that merciful one. Dorothy.
Question, Rick, pointed out that when Jesus was on the cross, he said to the one man, "You'll be with me."
Today, this day.
Yeah. But then, the Apostles' Creed says he descended into hell. Well, why did Christ have to go to hell? I just don't understand that. And he wasn't. Is he talking about the Father? That you'll be with me today?
So again, that's part of how we talk about what happens after this life. And again, did he descend to hell? Well, in some ways you could say God, Jesus was, if you want to think about it in very concrete terms about, Jesus went from this world into hell and then to resurrection. You could kind of read that as God was liberating hell. Think about as we liberated the concentration camps.
That's what I was just gonna say. Two of us can go into the same situation and have totally different viewpoints as to what is happening to us in that situation. So when I read Christ descended to hell, doesn't mean he was suffering the pains of hell. It means he was in hell.
Liberating.
Right.
He wasn't being conquered by it. But you would also say, if you read it as he descended to the dead, to the place of Sheol, to the place where the dead are, you might also be saying, and this is where I think the value of being able to say I can interpret these things differently in different days, because they have different meaning to me. and God is revealing things to me about that, is you could say Jesus was really dead. Jesus was really dead. He descended to the dead. He went to the land of the dead, where the place where the place, because of course we've got to have a place. Here you go, right? Even the soul has to go to some place, right? You know, we think about heaven as being a place. He went to this place of the dead. He was truly dead. You know, kind of like Lazarus was dead. You know, remember Lazarus came out of the tomb and stunk, you know, rotting flesh and stuff like that. Jesus was dead.
How does that fit with the people who say when you die, you go to sleep? See, that's to me, there's a conflict there, because when he descended to hell, he was sleeping and went to hell.
Well, you have the little girl who he raised, you know, who he said she's not dead, and they're laughing at him, and he's saying she's only asleep. So is sleep a metaphor? Is it, you know? So again, you know, how do we take the whole of the Bible and read it? Well, we understand Jesus is that Jesus did die and rose. That was the physical embodiment. In other words, that Jesus took on, but did he have to die? No. But there's something about his human identity. He suffered death. He suffered the non-existence. And when he resurrected, he was much the same, but he was much different. He didn't hang out with the disciples. That doesn't appear. In one case, you know, I think it was in Luke, you know, he said either the angel or the men, or it's different in all four gospels, send him up to Galilee where he's gonna, you know, ascend. And basically he gives him a little sermon there, and up he goes, right? In John, there's a little bit more time, but when we do the study, we understand John 20 and John 21 to probably have different authors and be different stories. And Mark, the first 8 verses of chapter 16 seem to be the authentic, which leave us really empty. Basically, the tomb's empty. That's it. And then the next, I think it's 8 verses. I think it goes to 16. Give us some other things, but he also gives us some wild stuff, like, you know, when you handle poisonous snakes and they bite you, they're not going to do any harm to you, right? Because you got the spirit in you. And thus, you know, you get some factions in this country that became snake handlers, right? They'd allow themselves, they'd have the snake bite them. Well, not bite, but inject them with poison. Right? So it brings us to Afterlife. I don't think we do a really good job talking about this because it's such a hard concept to understand. Where I kind of sell out on you guys is not my job. You know, that's beyond. After that moment of death, I have no more say in it, no more factors in it. That's all God's. You know, and I don't. And in some ways, it's a real cop-out, but in other ways, it really is just saying, this is the mystery. We don't really understand. What we can understand is this embodied life. We can't understand everything else. So we give images, and we give, you know, things, and we have saints and sinners and all kinds of things. But the whole understanding of afterlife in the scriptures is very inconsistent. Just like who's going to be saved and who's not going to be saved, it's very inconsistent.
I can't give you the verse, but the first Trinity and book of Hebrews both covered this area, and I've read them several times. And I've come to the same conclusion that it comes to God. Read it once more.
And guys like Cal Robinson and other, I did some conferences at Wheaton College, which is really kind of an interesting concept, because there it's a much more evangelical, and it's a much more, you got to have the answers, and certainly scriptures reveal everything. And you realize it, and you have the premillennialist and the postmillennialist, and you have all these different schools of thought, and you realize they're not even clear, and they've gone through the hoops to make it all kind of fan out, right? We don't do that. We basically say, you know, where there's a lot of difference of opinion, maybe it's really just talking in some metaphors that try to help us give us a handle at a time, but they're not speaking broadly about what is real and what's truth. So our scriptures are different and inconsistent. Judgment and mercy are God's. Again, you know, it's not really for us to make that decision. You know, a part of our determining judgment is basically to give us a handle on who went where and why. You know, did Hitler go? Does Putin have a chance? You know, and that kind of thing, you know? Well, how about me? You know? Well, and we do a lot of justification, you know, well, I'm no Hitler, you know? But that doesn't mean I'm less deserving of hell or, you know, some kind of consequence. So, you know, that's just our kind of manipulating. And that the reason we do this is we focus on faith in the present. As a matter of fact, you know, when I talk to people about eternity, I say, you know, we think a lot about this life and afterlife, and that being eternity. Like when I die and enter eternity, and I go, well, you know, there's a concept that's really wrong in that, because eternity doesn't mean when you die. Eternity doesn't have a beginning point. Eternity has no beginning. It's like infinity. It has no beginning or no end. And therefore you are right now in eternity. So right now we have, when we speak about that, we have the opportunity to participate in heaven. And so some people will say, I believe in heaven on earth. I believe in hell on earth. And I'd say, yeah, I do too. You know, I do know what hell on earth is like. And I do know what heaven on earth is like. And I've seen that. And I think we do experience. And people in what we would think is hell on earth can be the people who really are experiencing heaven, because they are those people who've been put upon and suffered the most, and somehow they have grace within them. And you have people who are given every gift of blessing, and they have hell going on inside of them, and they have no idea what's going on.
I always think of hell on earth as where God is not.
And I think how I would describe. Basically, where God is not is hell. It's kind of like where God is, there is faith, you know, there is grace. Where God is not, there is not.
So where would God not be?
That's a great question, but again, paradox. God is where, so I like to think about sin as the single predestination law. God is where I push God out. It's not, I'm predestined, I'm already given that God's with me and in me and that kind of thing, but it's where I push God away. You see why these are the controversial and difficult
Why do
times.
they call hell? Why don't they call it like Hades or?
They do. They do. Hades is a Greek term. Hades is a Greek mythology term. It wasn't necessarily a bad place. You know, it has some bad connotations. It does have a place of kind of suffering and, you know, punishment. We call it Sheol. We call it the dead, the land of the dead, that kind of thing. So we call it hell because we really don't. Again, to think of heaven and hell even as places is kind of it's something I need basically to I kind of have to grab something like that, because I'm within the structures of, I have to understand that I'm actually in a place and in a time, right? And, you know, so you get into some of these really abstract concepts, and you get into, what was the what was that show? The Twilight Zone.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, right? The Twilight Zone would like challenge your reality. The challenge your realities to say, you know, if you really think some abstract ways of thinking about this, the ways you've identified and structured your world don't always fit. And it can be scary, but it can be also joyful. So I like to think about, afterlife is a tool, it's a handle we put on things, but it's not necessarily something that I talk about with great, fervor and definitiveness. Same with this notion of being born again. And I think I'd probably speak about this a little bit more. But again, born again is an evangelical movement. And like the saying, there's the old life and the new life. There's the, and you hear about people backsliding and making their confession again because they did. And I think as Lutherans, we understand this process as being we're simultaneously saint and sinner. We're kind of constantly, did I tell you about my own way of thinking of thinking about preaching like an AC current? You know what an AC current, alternating current. It means the current sometimes flows this way and then it reverses. I think Tesla developed that, right? Yeah, Tesla, as compared to a direct current, which is the one I learned about in, when I was learning about electricity, the current always goes, from positive to the negative. So you create that loop, but the current's always flowing that way. And I say, I think of it the alternating current, because that when I'm feeling bad about myself, then grace fills me and it makes me feel better and good about myself until I get too full of myself. And then the law pushes me back and makes me feel bad about myself until I realize I need grace, so I can't, and I always tell people, when I'm preaching, you always think there are some people in this congregation who need a little kick in the fanny. And there's other people who need, just the warm arms of God, of grace. I said, the problem is usually the ones who need the grace feel the kick in the fanny, and the ones who need the kick in the fanny feel the grace and feel, so anyhow, so born again, it's less, we're less dualistic. Life is continually influenced by divine and non-divine, and each moment is an opportunity for choice and grace. Versus there was this point before I was, saved, and there's a point afterwards. And talking to 12-step people in the 12-step program, you'll hear them talk about I had my last drink, 40 days ago, 40 years ago, whatever. But you also hear them talk about that this is a continual process, that I'm always an addict. I'm always in that process. So those are some of the theological concepts that I am aware that you probably hear in our common literature, our common vocabulary from our culture, that we don't talk a lot about in church. And it might be fun to have a series, something like that, but Any other things that you want to talk about that way? I'm just going to get into this. This may be a little long and we can just kind of cut it at one or two or whatever. Social statements. This is what the church writes. The church shall develop social statements. We talked about this a little bit, that will guide the life of the church as an institution and inform the conscience of its members in the spirit of Christian liberty. Okay. From one of them. Essentially, they become teaching, and it's not it's and, teaching and policy documents. In other words, they're meant for us to use in the church to teach people, to talk about grace, to talk about God, to talk about aspects of life, but they're also to create policies of the church. Okay, so where we're going to advocate, where we're going to, talk to representatives and lobby and whatever. It's a broad framework to assist in thinking about and discussing. So they're meant not to be really specific. They're meant to think, in broad terms. Okay. To basically help us with those individual circumstances. And they help communities with moral formation, discernment, and thoughtful engagement with social issues. So that's how the ELCA puts that. Now, last week I said, let's choose three. And like I said, the three we chose were the three of the oldest ones. They were all written and they weren't written in 1991. They were all passed in 1991. That means for almost probably two triennial times they were being talked about. So for probably 6, 7, 8 years, they were probably being talked about, developed, voted upon, engaged in the conversation, and then the social statements were passed. The three we were going to talk about and were Church and Society, which is basically the first one passed, which says we should do this. As you can, as that last quote was, the one quote was from that Church and Society. That says basically we should do this. We should talk about how our faith interacts with topics of the day, especially controversial ones. The other one we chose was abortion, and the other one we chose about was the death penalty. You want to just kind of go to one and see how that goes? If you want, we can do this. As I said, there were workshops. Which one?
Abortion.
You want to go to abortion? Consensus? Okay. I think that's probably the one that's most current right now in people's mind. So abortion. What I did is I took its outline and summarized it. Okay. So the first thing it does in the abortion social statement is it identifies how are we unified. And so we get into the first bullet. It's not the base, it's the bias. I'm sorry, I wrote this light. So the bias of our unity, or no, the basis of our unity. It's not the bias, it's the basis of our unity. The basis of our unity is that we as a church have a common confession. We believe in a common Jesus. We somehow believe that God has called us into one life and one faith and one baptism, and that those are the most important things. That we're unified and in a desire to do what is God's bidding. We also have diversity, and that is seen as a gift. And it talks a little bit about how we should utilize that gift of diversity, basically by saying, we do this in a respectful manner. We understand, we do this and try to engage people who think differently. And we try to engage in some common conversation, but it's done on a respectful and in most cases on a basis of kind of presenting that other people are coming in faith too. Okay. How do we talk about our differences? And one of the things it says, how do we talk about our differences? And these, I put 2 bullets in here that were in the text. One was to uphold the values on both ends. There are values on both ends. We have value for all life, whether it's all human life has some value. And we honor that and we understand that as being. And so even life in a uterus has value. But we also understand that the ability for self-determination and for people to make decisions about what happens to them and what happens to the responsibilities that they're faced with, that's also something that we uplift. So we value both of those things. Also, the other thing it did was it tried to dismiss what we oftentimes hear about is the rights of the unborn or the rights of self-determination. It says basically to think in rights is not helpful in this discussion. To think more in terms that it's not the right of a baby to be born. It's not the right of a mother to be able to necessarily, or it's all intertwined. So basically it kind of says it gets out of that nomenclature of thinking and rights. And I think that was an important part of this, to be able to talk about it. So it says we have values that we uphold. We can uphold values even if they, kind of, the object's not to necessarily think about our end or where we stand, but to impress that there are values that we have, and to think less about it in terms of rights, because when you take away one right, then you've done harm to someone. The next thing it does, and like most of our social statements, I don't know that all, because there's not a formula for writing them, is this convictions of our faith. It almost always starts with getting us back to our beliefs. Now, this one references some scriptures, doesn't reference like extensively scripture, but it does reference scripture. One of the things that, it says is there's dignity of human beings created in God's image, and our responsibility and our accountability to God and self and others. That there's a certain amount of dignity that's provided to the human being. Okay. There's an intrinsic value of life in all phases of its development, that life in itself has value, not ultimate value, but value. That sin has corrupted God's creation, and we're all victims and we're all victimizers. We've all been victimized. We've all hurt somebody. We've all been hurt. So that kind of gets back to our notion of original sin. That God calls us to lives of repentance, renewal, and responsible living. So that where there's brokenness, that God's calling us back to heal. And that we are empowered to serve others, especially the most vulnerable, pregnant women, in this case, pregnant women in the lives in their wombs. Okay. So there's the convictions of faith. Section 3 talks about the church as a community supportive of life. So it says that the strong, and so you should hear this, for people who think that, sometimes that our social statements come out wishy-washy, this is a quote: "The strong Christian presumption is to preserve and protect life. Abortion ought to be an option only of last resort. Therefore, as a church, we seek to reduce the need to turn to abortion as an answer for unintended pregnancies." Okay. Another quote is, "We deplore circumstances that lead a woman to consider abortion as the best option available to her." So that's getting into that there are circumstances that make this seem like a better option than anything else. And there are those circumstances. We need to address those circumstances as well, whatever they might be. The church is a community supportive of life. It provides, it says that we need to provide for the needs of women facing problematic pregnancies. I think I made a comment on Facebook, which I don't normally do, but as Alabama was doing their new abortion law, they had also cut and reduced all the programs for early childhood development. Food for the WIC program, what used to be known as the WIC program. They were cutting, wellness checks and health insurance for the poor and everything else. So it's like, you can't just care for people in the womb and then not care for them afterwards. So you have to provide for women's, and you also have to provide for women who are facing problematic pregnancies. And it identifies some of the things that create problematic pregnancies. It says that the church, so that means that the church needs to be involved in providing for those needs. Basically, it lays it on the church, not on society. So it means that, you know, if a person's worried about not having health care for their child or for themselves or their family, you know, it's the church's responsibility to provide that health care. It's that church's responsibility to provide care if they're a single parent, that we should be providing care for that child, and we should be providing, you know, if, you know, whatever is needed for that problematic pregnancy. Now, the church should also have hospitality, including providing daycare, nurseries, services, and shelter, foster care, and adoption. So basically, the church should be involved in all the services that also make giving birth a more viable option. The third point in it, it says that with the notion of wanting to keep unintended pregnancies, says that marriage is the appropriate context for sexual intercourse. Which is interesting because 91 and today, kind of a different world. But I don't think the church really has still gotten away from that. It affirms that the church should be doing sex education in the context of faith, beginning in the elementary years and continuing on through adult years. So we should be doing sex education. And then lastly, it reminds us that that males bear a lot of responsibility in this, and that we should be pushing and upholding the responsibility of males in this context. This is another quote. This is from that third section. This church challenges the following life-degrading attitudes that permeate the prevailing culture and may contribute to the high incidence of abortion. Messages in the media and elsewhere that encourage irresponsible sexual activity, materialism, individualism, and excessive concern for self-interest. The desire for perfect children and treating those who are not as if they were disposable. Attitudes and practices that are inhospitable to children and to women who bear them. Low regard for human life, especially the lives of African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, or Native Americans, and many women and children who are poor. One of the places where I would say this is that oftentimes, you know, the church will, you know, this was lifelong as a pastor, is children be invited into the worship. You know, they cry, they make noise. I can't hear the sermon, right? How about developmentally disabled children who have, you know, long-term developmental disabilities? How do we do that? Are we welcoming them? So it really kind of says that church, you know, you're responsible for this. By the way, just so you know, one of the neatest things that I've seen in the church in recent years is a concept called playgrounds. In the sanctuary, they have a little section that is kind of like it's like a little play area. It's got the whole the stove and the, you know, and it's got slide, it has soft toys, no pots and pans, but you know, books and coloring and stuff like that. And they call it the playground. And it's right in the sanctuary. So parents can watch their kids, the kids can be involved, they can be involved in their way, but they can participate. I think it's just like, gosh, that is so phenomenal. That's great. We used to provide a cry room. So guidance. So the fourth part really just gets into this is where the church's guidance is. Obviously, it's already said. Abortion should be the exception, should not be the rule. It should, you know, in most cases, we support that children should be given life. So it seeks, I can't remember if I passed something or not. Basically, it says that the guidance in making decisions regarding unintended pregnancies is that should seek support of pastors, professionals. So people with problematic pregnancies should seek the support of these people, and the church should encourage that, encourage people to talk about their feelings, their emotions, their thoughts, their worries, and that they should be received in a non-judgmental fashion that is supportive. Pastors and other members should be trained in this. Pastoral response must be gracious and affirming of the value of women's life and assistance in dealing with ongoing implications. So then the guidance in making decisions regarding unintended pregnancies, continuing the pregnancy. Basically, we say that's generally the default that we should be looking at, that we encourage people to continue the pregnancy, and that we will support the mother as a parent, and we will provide for adoption. And it particularly identifies adoption and making resources available for people, for children who are, what do we call them? Less desirable. I hate using that phrase, but children who may have more complications. It does provide for opportunities to end a pregnancy. It says, ending a pregnancy, this church recognizes that there can be sound reasons for ending a pregnancy through induced abortion. Ending a pregnancy, this church recognizes that there can be sound reasons for ending a pregnancy through induced abortion. In reflecting ethically on what should be done in the case of unintended pregnancy, consideration should be given to the status and condition of the life of the womb. We also need to consider the conditions under which the pregnancy occurred and the implications of the pregnancy of the woman's life. So essentially, the three conditions are: one is the life, is the complications of the fetus so complicated that if they came out, their life would be limited, it would be painful. There's circumstances where the church feels like that's a proper time for an induced abortion. Also, upon the conditions of the pregnancy, if it was non-consensual sex, if it was incest or rape or something like that, that induced abortion should be acceptable. And lastly, that the implications of what this is mean for the mother's life is something that's acceptable to understand and comprehend. So basically, it kind of goes back to what used to be said is, abortion should be the exception, not the rule. And that, the one place we can probably come together on this is let's end unintended abortion, unintended pregnancies. Let's try to keep them limited. So you can see here's where the guidance of ending a pregnancy is allowed, where life, or I shouldn't say allowed, where the church lifts it and says that these are appropriate places, where the life of the woman is threatened when sexual intercourse is not consensual, such as rape and incest, extreme fetal abnormality, not when. So this kind of goes the other. It should not happen when the fetus can live outside of the uterus. So I think that's is it 24 weeks is the kind of the Roe versus Wade.
That's the premise of that. Right?
That's kind of the premise of that, is that it's viable outside of the uterus. And then that as a church, we should be continuing to deliberate. So as our society is continuing to deliberate, we should be looking at this. By the way, there is a study guide on this. And then it talks about public policy. It says, that as a society, we should be working to prevent unintended pregnancies. As a society, we should support life after the birth so that it's not a hardship on women to give birth, or that they don't have undue consequences. See that there should be regulation of abortion that has sufficient consensus to be enforceable, that can contribute toward, again, I'm sorry for the spelling error, toward the intended goals without generating worse problems, and to protect life as well as the dignity of women and their freedom, and to make responsible decisions in difficult situations. So, and then here's a whole bunch of regulations of abortion. This is what they say: total lack of regulation of it, the church opposes total lack of regulation legislation, that it opposes legislation that would outlaw abortion in all circumstances. It opposes laws that prevent access to information about all options available to women faced with unintended pregnancies. It opposes laws that deny access to safe and affordable services for morally justifiable abortions. It opposes mandatory or coerced abortion or sterilization. It opposes laws that prevent couples from practicing contraception, and it opposes laws that are primarily intended to harass those contemplating or deciding for an abortion. Some issues requiring further, so again, this is public policy. Some issues requiring further deliberation: spouse or partner or parental consent. Should spouses have to be able to give consent? Should parents have to be able to give consent for minors? Whether public funding should be used or not used for this. It kind of identifies that, public funding, if my tax dollars are used for something that I vehemently disagree with, that's not fair, but also that to make this inaccessible only to those who are rich enough to have it is also not fair. And it encourages public debate in a respectful manner, not like what we have. So, in conclusion, I forgot one more. In conclusion, the church's role in society begins long before and extends far beyond legislative regulation. It seeks to shape attitudes and values that affirm people in whatever circumstances they find themselves. As pastoral care, compassionate outreach, and life-sustaining assistance are crucial in supporting those who bear children, as well as those who choose not to do so. Through these and other means, people of God seek to be truly supportive of life. So that's a typical Lutheran social statement. You're not going to find it's a hard and fast, never, ever, no way, no how, or we kind of anything goes. You're going to find that there's usually a both and. It usually begins with some kind of understanding of the faith. Sometimes it'll include more scriptures. Sometimes it'll include our concepts. It will also include discussion of science, and it will also include social sciences understandings. So how do you feel about your church for writing a statement like that?
Is there any language in here at all saying that there's a body and a soul?
Nope. Nope.
I assume the pastor has a responsibility to the person's discussing a possibility of an abortion. Is there a position that the Lutheran Church has on that, specifically ELCA? And is there a pastor you take it?
I don't think so. I've never been trained in anything like that. In terms of my training has been, to provide good pastoral counsel, which basically is affirmative listening, helping people kind of think through the consequences, sometimes offering some alternative options, and being an advocate for them.
We support the position.
Yeah. Sometimes it's like in most cases, like if any of you came to me with a moral dilemma, I would probably also ask, well, what about this? What about this other perspective? What about this other person? What about, how do you do that? How do you find consistency in
This
that?
is not related to abortion, but I want to thank Al for his observation, what Luther actually did at that time. And that be one of the aspects of it, was what we were discussing, Al, trying to
Mhm.
get.
I think it's very rational, intellectually coherent, easy to understand, but accounts for gray areas and need for individual decisions on individual cases as opposed to ironclad statements. I think it's very well done.
Yeah.
On a really tough issue.
You know, what's interesting is, Al, I agree with you. I think it is something, and I know that, you know, you paraphrase this, right? But it seems balanced and nuanced. If you go back, if you wouldn't mind, can you go back about 5-6 slides?
Public policy guidance.
Go back up to that, right there, down, go forward. No, right there, right there. I wonder how long they debated the word sound, right? Because it doesn't say appropriate or allowed. It essentially says they're understandable reasons, right? And it really kind of shifts the onus, you know, onto the person, right? As opposed to providing a guidance. It just says the arguments they're making are understandable, and they understand that they cannot be just dismissed, right? And I think that's really well written there.
It's informed, but I think the other aspect that I, you know, especially as I was doing that and thinking about the, you know, contemplating that in light of the sermon, was the reality that the social statement talks a lot about the responsibility of the church to provide, to get all of the objection, you know, essentially to eliminate the person from having, you know, objections of need, or not being welcomed, or not having a place to go, or all those things that the church basically, you know, if the church can provide for all those needs, it has that responsibility. Not if they can, it's our responsibility to do that, to take that burden and provide for at least the sound reasons to be less, you know.
Are you aware of what other Lutheran synods have?
I am not aware of that.
Like, I wonder what the Lutheran synod says about this.
I don't know. That'd be really good.
Yeah, it would be interesting, because I don't know that it would be this balanced, I think.
Well, I mean, we can probably do a web search too.
If there was something I was surprised at, it was the trimester piece. You know.
Oh, really?
Well, you know, I don't know that I would say, you know, that I absolutely disagree with it, but I was surprised at that.
What I'm going to tell you is, if you go to, can you see my screen? I already know what I'm doing this week. Go to ELCA social statements, and then to this top link, get a page that looks like this. And scrolling down, there's the social statements. And then if I click on abortion, you'll see that I can download the social statement in the green box. I can engage with a study guide there, but I can also read an introduction and a brief summary. So you can get those if you'd really like to, just kind of like, I'd like to familiarize myself, but I don't want to read the 16-page document, although it's pretty.
I agree with that.
There you go.
I think it's well
So.
constructed.
I think you'll find most of our social statements to be done that kind of manner, but I can't think of any that don't start with some kind of recognition of faith, of talking about the faith place. Some use more scripture, but some, you know, but it all kind of says, this is where our faith starts. And it usually starts with things that are really not controversial at all. You know, we believe in Jesus, we believe, you know, we're created in God's image, things like that. and then it goes into, here's the circumstances, here's the situation, and here's what science tells us, or here's what what we understand is the dilemma. I think this one deals more with the divided nature and that this is a complicated issue than really anything else. And it says, and it recognizes that and it honors that. So. So that's that. All right. So one more week of me. Next week should be a lot easier. Is there anything you want to know about how the church runs, how the bigger church runs, or, structure or anything like that? You want to know how we got bishops instead of presidents or anything like that?
The